So let's start with Cliff. Good morning. Really glad to have you here. And I'd love it if you could share a bit with our trainees first about your career path and how you ended up in your current position. Because I know while some of these folks, some are in academia already, but some are in state positions themselves, some are in nonprofit organizations, and they may also be thinking about their future career path and what kinds of positions that they want to pursue.
Sure. So good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Cliff Chaung. I work at the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education with Pierre. And apologies to Pierre in advance because he's already heard this, or at least some version of this. Yes, I started my career as a middle school math teacher, but actually, I actually became a science teacher because, as what happens typically to first-year teachers, you're first in and you get the worst assignments, and they also give you out-of-field subjects to teach. So I ended up being a 7th grade math and science teacher, and a 10th grade teaching a class called Critical Thinking and Problem Solving, which was a class that was required for every 10th grader to take in order to graduate, but it was not required to be passed in order to graduate. So that was my first set of assignments, which I found out about like 3 days before the start of my first school year. So that is unfortunately quite typical, I think, for those of you who have ever been in the education profession. The hardest assignments go to the least experienced people because seniority rules over everything in terms of assignments of classes. So I spent 4 years teaching at that school in Boston, Boston Public Schools. And then I made a shift to a charter school in Boston called the Academy of the Pacific Rim Charter School. And during that time, I did get my master's degree in secondary mathematics teaching, thought that I was going to keep doing it. Thought that the switch in environment with more agency around changes to school policy in a charter school would make a difference in terms of my job satisfaction, which it did, except it didn't change the fundamental aspects of teaching, which involve lots of young people who make their own decisions, sometimes not always the best decisions. And no matter what, if you're doing your job, you're always there to support and help pick up the pieces. And I found that eventually I realized that that was not the best fit for my personality type or my temperament, very emotionally draining. So through a series of events, some planned and some, I think, divinely inspired, I got connected up with a job here at Desse in Massachusetts as an analyst in the office, the charter school office at the time, leading efforts to analyze charter school finance and data. And I made that shift towards the end of the my eighth year of teaching. And overnight, my anxiety and depression I was experiencing about job work disappeared. It really was a fit, I think, in terms of how to plug into the broader mission of creating educational opportunity for all students. And that started my trajectory sort of engaging directly with researchers, because one of the things that became immediately apparent is at the time we didn't really have robust methodology to comparative metrics that were very hot button at the time, still are to a lesser extent, related to comparing charter school performance to the performance of the schools that those students would have gone to had the charter school not existed. And typically what happens is people look at the aggregate sort of average test score and compare, and whichever one is higher is better. But as you probably all know, that is not sort of very rigorous in terms of controlling for variables, controlling for selection bias, controlling for all sorts of things. And from there, as part of my job, I began to develop relationships with various researchers realizing that we had the data, but researchers have the firepower and the bandwidth and lots of eager doctoral students usually who have to research something to graduate, and they didn't have the data to do it. So in any case, that was part of my job. I made a few transitions within the department. And then the opportunity came up to direct the charter school office at the New York State Department of Education, which I initially did not want to take because I didn't want to move my family to Albany, New York. But through for a series of reasons, which you can ask me about later if you want the full story, I did. And I was there for 22 months. As soon as I got there, very shortly thereafter, my current employer reached out to see if I was interested in coming back, which I did. So I came back 22 months later in a role at the time, at an associate commissioner role that was the manager for the offices that I had previously worked in. And then it has since expanded. I gained additional responsibility. And at this point, lead policy for the agency across offices that comprise educational options. So this includes charter schools and other school redesign initiatives, our virtual schools. The reason why I'm here today probably is because it also now includes our career technical education programs, early colleges, our adult education programs, our connections to the early education space, out of school time, summer programming. And it also includes our interfacing with students and families more directly. So our student support functions and our parent support functions, including our state complaint system. So that is, in a nutshell, what I do now.
Those are a lot of areas that you cover. Interesting that you began as a math teacher because Chaung did so as well.
Yes.
Although I think in high school,
well, I was intending to start in high school, but the school I landed at was grades 7 through 12, and as I had mentioned, they assign people last in gets the last choice, right? So people didn't want to teach second graders.
Right. Okay. Wow. Well, that really, interesting career path there. And interesting that you went for a few years to New York and back to Massachusetts, and now have quite a portfolio that you oversee. We just have a few slides to be sure that we hit a few different points with Cliff.
Yeah. So I think Sean. I don't know if you all know Sean Doherty. I think maybe
he's been with them all week.
Okay.
Yep.
So I think Sean asked me to share, Sean and I have, he's asked me to share in different settings. And just to go back to the first time, when I started working for the state, as I mentioned, charter schools were the most hot button topic at the time. And I sort of on my own sort of pushed for more rigor around comparative analyses, especially when we were making high stakes decisions about individual charter schools and whether or not they should stay open. One of the first research contracts that I executed at the agency was a contract with a company that did analyses that simply did t-tests of significance when you compared a charter school to its sending district. Is the difference actually statistically significant? It didn't control for anything. It didn't attempt to explain, but it was simply to get at the fact that the charter school is a much smaller entity most of the time. And when you compare it to a larger entity, there's more potential for error if you treat that sort of smaller group of students as a sample of the larger population. So I at least wanted to get us to a point where we could at least say whether or not the differences were actually meaningful or whether we're just within the band of margin of error. I'm not a statistician by training, although I do have a mathematics degree. So it was sort of pushing the envelope at the time to sort of say, even though a charter school has, let's say, 20% proficient in math in 8th grade, and a district has 40% proficient, it could possibly be a meanerless difference, especially if the charter school only had 16 tested students, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that was the first contract. We published a report. It was groundbreaking at the time in the sense that we even applied any sort of statistical sort of lens to the comparison. But soon after, or a couple of years later, we hired our first research director. Her name was Carrie Conaway. I don't know if I know Sean and I have worked with her until she now teaches at Harvard Graduate School of Education, but she inaugurated a whole systemic change at the department related to the fact that we have all these researchers out there with capacity and interest, but don't have the data. So she and I worked together to work with Harvard Grad School of Ed at the time to actually do a much more rigorous study of charter schools and their comparative performance, focused in Boston, but then also statewide, which I think was at the time sort of the start of a whole rash of charter school research. Claim some maybe credit in the sense that it did kickstart this sort of a wave of research that tried to leverage and exploit, I think is the word you researchers use, the lottery designs that are required by state law in Massachusetts and in other states for admission to charters, and the fact that they had such strong demand. So because you have such a rich sort of experimental design and lots of students in either pool and lots of policy interest, it only made sense to use that in order to actually answer questions about whether or not the differences that we see in performance are in fact meaningful and attributable to the enrollment in the charter school. So we fought a lot of battles with lawyers in terms of sharing data, got to know the FERPA law very well, but ultimately we were able to kickstart a new way of doing business where now it is par for the course, as Pierre may know. We have research studies ongoing in all manner of areas. I personally, right now there are ongoing studies in adult basic education, similarly exploiting some lottery admissions processes and for our larger programs. We have a whole host of research that Sean and I are working on with respect to CTE. We have ongoing charter research that has iterated, dozens of times over from those initial studies, looking at various aspects of charter performance, reaching much further out into economic wage data, similar to what we're doing in CTE. There's research on social emotional learning, research on the efficacy of certain curriculums. Basically we've and this is now, as I understand it, and Carrie would be better to explain this, but other states have now, so there's a whole community out there where state departments of education and researchers are partnered to basically marry the best of what each system does. States having the data, states making policy, but not having the people or the sort of infrastructure to do research. And then research who do have the infrastructure and the smarts and the people, but don't have the data that is policy relevant. So that's why it's a match made in heaven.
I have a question, Cliff. To what extent does Massachusetts contribute funds for this research, or do you expect the researchers to find the funds, or is it a combination?
It is a combination. So, hold on one sec. So the very initial study, if you could call it that, was something that was funded out of our federal charter schools grant, and a subsequent one was also funded out of that. That at the time, that was my more narrow domain, but I had responsibility for that grant. And I made the case that contracting with a research partner was a much more efficacious way to evaluate our charter school performance as a state. So once that happened, though, it spawned, again, a lot of interest in terms of grad students who need to do research for their dissertations. So in many of these situations, all we're doing is giving data. So we have a bunch of fellows. I forget the names of these fellowships, the Pierre Fellowship, not Pierre, or my colleague Pierre, but P-I-E-R. I forget what it stands for. A Rappaport Fellowship, some with Harvard Grad School of Ed. We work with students from MIT and Brown, and a lot of the local sort of around Massachusetts. So we have a number of students who are just happy to have our data in order to, and their research is funded through their graduate school programs. There are other cases where we do contract on a very specific project that we want to hire someone for and not necessarily have a grad student do because of timing or importance. So we have a contract that's concluding with AIR and Chaung as I think a subcontractor on that project. It concludes at the end of this month, actually, that will address some relatively controversial, now the sort of controversy policy-wise, at least in Massachusetts, has shifted to career technical education. Away from charter schools due to the fact that there aren't any new ones opening, and to career technical ed. So it's a mix of both.
Okay, thanks.
I think we can probably go to the next slide, although I don't know if I already talked about it too, possibly. Yeah, probably I talked about this, but yeah. I think that what I would highlight here is this sort of mutual benefit arrangement. It is like the best of marriages. You sort of want to complement each other. And in order for this to work, the research interest of the researcher must align with the policy interest or the practice interest of the state education agency. We have had times when people ask for data to do studies that have no relevance to what we're interested in. And Carrie Conaway, now Matthew Denninger, who's Pierre's boss, I believe, is the Chief Strategy and Research Officer is the title we have in Massachusetts. And they serve as a gatekeeper to determine which studies we will sort of green light and which partnerships we'll enter into. We do try to make sure that we're not having various researchers duplicate effort. And we also want to make sure, again, that if we give data, we need to get some benefit from it. So we obviously, I think it's a mutually beneficial arrangement, but states have a fair degree of power in the relationship because obviously you can't do anything without data. So we wield that carefully to ensure that when we provide data, it's provided to a reputable organization, and the researchers are abiding by ethics and privacy rules, and that again what they produce will actually inform real life decisions. So in the case of the charter work that started this all, it really did inform the ongoing debate about whether charters should be allowed to expand. And it also informed our sort of individual decisions around specific schools to determine whether performance is sufficiently strong to warrant continued authorization. So I think one other point I'll reinforce on this from this slide is that however things are written up, they need to be written up in a way that normal human beings can understand. And as some of you may know, sometimes research papers can be quite dense with lots of Greek letters and equations, and very few policy people will read the full thing or understand it. So the ability for the research partner to actually distill what the main points are and why they matter is most definitely a key aspect of the partnership. If that isn't present, then the partnership probably won't work very well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But I'm sure the researchers are aiming to publish in journals. That may be their key goal, especially if they're in a tenure track position. So do you ever have any, there could be some competing interests here. Although, as you say, you really wield the power since you have the data.
I mean, what typically happens is that, especially if it's on contract, for example, the current contract that we have with Chaung and AIR, they will be producing a report that is for our exclusive benefit at our direction, but it will probably spawn, several, if not even dozens of papers, potentially separate academic papers that drill into one or more aspects of the research. That happens all the time in terms of having a policy facing distilled sort of, these are the key points, and then academic papers that are for the academic people that drill into different aspects or iterate on the initial research. Most of the research studies, as you all know as researchers, spawn more research, and so they are very generative in terms of analyzing other states with the same methodology or comparing another, drilling into a particular new aspect that was not fully researched in the first sort of attempt. So there usually isn't an issue with that as long as research partners can meet our needs in terms of timeline and format. Once that's done, they're free to continue to publish, although we typically do ask for courtesy review if it sort of was based on the data that we gave.
Okay. Next slide.
So I mentioned this earlier. Most definitely the most difficult part of these partnerships often is establishing the legal permission to give data and the actual transfer of data in a secure manner. So the development of these MOUs and data use agreements is probably the hardest part of any project. And that's why if we can establish ongoing relationships with researchers like Chaung, it makes things a lot easier because you build trust around the fact that the researcher won't misuse the data and trust that the researcher will produce something of use to the state. And then you can piggyback off of prior memorandums of understanding, because once the data is transferred, as long as there's ongoing permission, they can use the data to analyze different aspects. So it is most definitely it seems like a technical matter, but it is truly one of the biggest impediments to good research, and lots of things died on the vine because of this. Before the research director position was established at Mass DESE, several research projects died because in my role at the time, didn't have sufficient positional authority to push through the negotiations that would have to happen. And there was a much stricter reading of FERPA. But once we established the research director, one of the biggest things to actually break through getting this partnership to go. So I would say if you are interested in partnering with state education agencies, or any state agency for that matter, to do research, that you need to build in the time and the expertise to navigate the legal waters to avoid getting derailed at the outset.
There's something in the chat box.
Yeah, I'm just taking that.
Yeah. A resource from the WT Grant Foundation that includes templates. Wow.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
I don't know if is this the last slide? I can't remember. There weren't
I
very
think it
many.
is. So we're really happy for our students to share some questions now. What questions do you all have for Cliff?
Don't be shy. Jill, would you mind unsharing so that we can more easily see people? Great, thanks.
Sure.
Thanks.
Hi, Cliff. My name is Manish. I'm from the, I work at the New York City Department of Education.
Oh, hi.
I could imagine that there are instances where researchers might be finding results that would not reflect positively on the state agency. And so when considering researchers' desire to be able to report those results through some type of research paper or anything like that, how have you navigated those conversations to make sure that researchers are able to stay objective and independent, but while at the same time working at a state agency that might be politically motivated, making sure that your higher ups aren't upset or frustrated or aggravated by those?
That never happens. No, I'm kidding. So one thing that I think is important is, so I am now maybe technically at least a medium up, if not a higher up, right? And you want to be sure you have a executive level sponsor who is committed to the rigor of the research. And I think having someone in a research director role is very helpful. So we have a planning and research office, which Pierre is a part of. And part of their role is to referee or ensure that there is objectivity on the part of the policy makers and the policy interests, and maybe to some lesser extent the political sort of arena, and fidelity on the part of the research process. So even this CTE ongoing research, assuming this is a closed space because it's not yet public, there's some controversy there. And we are purposely hewing very closely to relying on the research office to do sort of final review of the report. There are different folks who have different interests. And I think one thing that we've done, worked very hard to do at the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education is to be what I call Switzerland in terms of the policy debates that rage around various topics like charter schools and vocational technical schools. And it's actually, it depends on who you're, the same result can be viewed positively or negatively, right, depending on the stakeholder. And because we strive to be Switzerland and objective in our policymaking, and with the North Star being what is actually in the best interest of students to the greatest extent, we have typically been fine with whatever, the research says. We obviously do work with our researchers, especially when they're on contract, around framing to make sure not to unnecessarily inflame debates that where people might be like, see, we were right, when in fact that's not actually what the research is saying. So one of the issues that's come up in the current study is around internal versus external validity, I think is the concept, which is you take something like charter schools or vocational technical schools, and what's very important is to establish what the sort of scope of inquiry was with respect to what was the sample that you researched, and to what extent are the results more broadly applicable, or are they very narrowly constrained to the sites of inquiry. And what researchers like to do, what political people and policy people like to do is to cherry pick a headline or result and then apply it to their preferred policy position. And this happens a lot in the charter school space, where we'll have a national study that says charter schools on average aren't really all that much better than their district schools, or in fact worse. And so then someone in Massachusetts who hates charter schools is going to grab that headline and say, see, charter schools are bad, right? When in fact, when you read that actual study, when they isolate Massachusetts, Massachusetts is an outlier and says that charter schools are actually on average stronger. And when you look at certain measures, so use the broader research study to make a point in a local area, which is in fact completely the opposite, or vice versa, right? Where you take a local Massachusetts specific results around charter schools and then make your case nationally about why charter schools are great. Disregarding the policy environment in which the actual intervention is being operationalized. And so in Massachusetts, I would say that we don't tend to greenlight research unless we have some hunch about the fact that it's worth researching, right? So this may be, so I would say that, I'm not going to ask someone to look at something if I don't really think there's something there. So usually there is non-rigorous data to point to the fact that maybe this is a good thing, right? And the research comes in to actually corroborate or to quantify the extent to which what we think is a good thing is really a good thing. I will tell you that maybe the one area that has yielded, and it's still in process, maybe results that were less strong than maybe people had hoped, is when we look at, I'm going to leave it more general. There are a few places where you kind of want to know, like, is what you're seeing really value add on the part of the investment or policy intervention, or is it really just selection bias and or noise, right? But we go into it with eyes wide open, knowing that you could get the answer you don't want. And if you don't want to have to stand by the answer you don't want, then don't greenlight the research, right? So if you're truly wanting to make policy that is in the best interest of students, that drives towards equity and drives towards eliminating systemic inequality, you have to be prepared to rigorously interrogate what you're spending money on and what policies you're supporting. If you're not willing to actually change as a result of the data, then I'd say get out of the policymaking business. And research partnerships are obviously not worth wasting the time on. So I think we have an institutional culture around the fact that we're going to act on what we hear from researchers. And as long as if you have that attitude going in, then it's less of an issue. We're, I think, much less political than some state departments of education because of our governance structure. In places where the chief state school officer is directly appointed by the governor or is elected, right? I think there is much more potential to have to navigate that kind of thing when research might not go with your preferred pet policy project or intervention. But I don't think we face that as much because we're not in the business of pet policy projects, or at least I'm not. So.
I also wanted to add a couple of things, Cliff. So in addition to having like the research team like peruse like the article for like methods and like terminology and like contextual understanding and so on and so forth, we also work very collaboratively with the researcher throughout the project. So we have like quarterly or monthly check-ins, like during which they update us on like what they're finding. So like essentially by the time it's ready for publication, there are no surprises to the agency. I don't know if that helps your question, Manish.
Yeah, thanks, Pierre. And I would say that I'm probably more of a, I think researchers generally enjoy working with me and my team, but I'm like, what'd you find? What'd you find? What'd you find? What'd you find? Can we get a preview? Can we get a preview? So there are times when I'm like, sort of like, I really want to know. And they're like, oh, we have to go through quality control and we haven't so but because there's this ongoing, it's not just like, here's the study and a year later they send you the report. As Pierre says, it's a very collaborative and interactive process so that surprises are signaled, right? And then we have time to at least figure out how to message it. But I would say that we, to my knowledge, we've never killed a study, right? Because we didn't like what it was saying. So.
Yeah.
I have a really general question for you, just because I'm curious to hear your perspective, because you're approached by a lot of researchers, I imagine, who want work. So what would you say in your perspective is something you wish those researchers or those potential researchers did more, and something you wish they did less, you know, to facilitate a partnership?
So maybe one thing that does happen in research partnerships is that this may be an unfair, gross overgeneralization, but I think researchers as a whole can have a tendency to hone in on something that they're really interested in, that really is not salient from a policy standpoint, right? But it's interesting from an academic standpoint. And there are times, I think, when we have in these sort of iterative conversations that Pierre referenced, we give feedback on the fact that actually that's not really worth spending much more time investigating, right? It's not gonna, you know, whatever you find there is not really helpful. And there, I think, flexibility, you know, in terms of making sure that the research is well aligned with the policy interests, especially if it's on our dime, right? Is something, maybe if I had to pick something that would, you know, help improve the relationship. But I mean, honestly, by and large, all of the research partnerships that I've been involved in have been positive. And I think the researchers who enter into these kinds of partnerships oftentimes have personal employment experience in the education sector. They were a former teacher or what have you. Chaung's a former teacher, right? Like where they get it, right? So I think there's a self-selection, if you will, of researchers who enter into these partnerships because they understand how important it is, because they either sat in a policy position or in the classroom. And so there really hasn't been a lot of drama on that front. And we generally don't continue any research partnerships that aren't fruitful from that or that didn't work well. And I do think there are some that we have steered clear of for subsequent sort of relationships if it didn't work out with that respect.
Yeah. Like Chaung, he knows this is not an abstract exercise. You know, he gets that this is connected to real students and their lives. So, yeah. Other questions?
Cliff, could you talk a little bit about disseminating the findings, and are the researchers helpful in kind of translating the findings for different audiences, you know, beyond your agency, like parents or legislature or the business community?
Yeah, I mean, that process is can be delicate. Needs to be done with great thought, and it's much more of a process of communications and media relations and PR than it is about research, as you probably know. So with any sort of research of any import, there's this whole, like, we're beginning that process now with the CTE research that I've talked about. Which stakeholders are going to care? Which ones do you want to send a preview copy to, embargoed or what have you? do you want to give anyone a chance to comment on any of the framing prior to actual finalization, or is it more of a heads up courtesy kind of thing? Who do you not engage in that way because they aren't trusted to actually keep confidence, and then will use it to advance their own policy agenda? So it is definitely a part of every research study. If it's going to have impact and meaning, then the release of it into the world is going to involve a lot of thoughtful communication and planning. So if that doesn't happen with any of the papers that you work on, then you should worry about whether anyone's going to read it or care about what you found. So that is definitely a whole sort of part of the process in and of itself. I would say on the front end, the whole legal negotiation around the memorandum of understanding and the data privacy, and that is like the big sort of nut to crack. And then on the back end, this is the whole other sort of piece about how to birth the actual research into the world to actually have impact. Because obviously it can inform what you do as a state education department in terms of policy, but if you're going to make any significant policy changes, you usually want to cite the research that might be part of the run up to that. So you need to make it public, and you need to share it in a way that is digestible and respectful of the work that is being analyzed. So.
Thank you.
Could I ask a question?
Sure.
You mentioned about adult education. Can I ask you, like, what's hot or what's pertinent right now in terms of what you would fund for post-secondary or adult education?
So the adult education that I'm referring to is for adults who have not yet gotten their high school diploma and or have not yet gained sufficient English proficiency to really access the workforce or higher education. So we fund a state system of adult basic education, and there's been advocacy around increasing the amount of money put into it. In the education space, K-12 is like the 800-pound gorilla in the room. It gets the most funding, even though there's a lot of discussion about teachers not being paid enough and underfunding of K-12 education. Relatively speaking, it is funded at much higher levels than higher education, early education, or adult education. And so or out of school time, summer sort of education. And so in Massachusetts, and this is, I think, very similar across the country, there's lots of advocacy around more robustly funding these other systems to come up to a level of professional qualification and standard for instructors that would support gain. Adult education, I think, is sometimes the most underfunded because it's viewed as, well, why didn't these people just, get it the first time? The way I view it is that this is evidence of the systemic failure of our education system in terms of particular populations of adults who weren't able to access the system as it exists because it's a factory model of education. If you don't fit in, then you get spit out. So there's an obligation on our part, I think, to provide those second chances. And secondly, some of these adults didn't have any chance in the first place because they're new to the country and haven't been given the opportunity to get education. So from a policy standpoint, what we want to establish is whether this investment is worth it, right? Do the outcomes related to investing in these kinds of classes, which in Massachusetts are free, actually yield benefit for the Commonwealth as a whole? And the initial research coming out of this research partnership is that yes, in terms of return on investment, in terms of increased tax revenue generated by these adults in terms of their gainful employment, it more than pays for itself. We also looked at voter civic engagement in terms of voter participation with significant and statistically significant increases in voter participation. So that is newer work. It's actually, I think, nationally groundbreaking also in the sense that people haven't really thought to study this as rigorously. So we are trying to expand. We focused in on one city and one very large program, but we're in the process of looking at a larger catchment of programs to see if it's really a systemic statewide benefit or if it's just this one program happens to be run very well. And we're looking again at our policy infrastructure on how we oversee and support these programs to see what actually generates the highest value for the individual adults who are getting the opportunity, but also for the Commonwealth in terms of return on investment. So that's what we're doing in Adult Ed.
Any final question or comment? Okay, well, thank you so much, Cliff. This has been really interesting and really informative for our students, and we thank you for taking the time to be with us today, and we hope we can invite you back next summer for our next class of trainees.
Sure. It was great to see all of you, and have a great finish to your institute.
Yeah. Thank you so much, and take care.
Thanks.
Thank you.